You are the master of your fate. Let's begin. Most women enter marriage believing they are signing up for companionship, for shared laughter over breakfast, for matching holiday sweaters, for whispered dreams tucked between the sheets before sleep. But what they are truly entering, whether they realize it or not, is a covenant with a future that does not yet exist, one that only he can build and only you can protect. I have sat across from countless women in my years of study, women who came to me weary and wounded, convinced they had failed because their husband no longer looked at them the way he once did, because his attention had turned to ledgers and blueprints and distant horizons, because they felt like ghosts drifting through the halls of their own homes. What none of them understood in those early days was that their invisibility was not a sign of neglect. It was a requirement of his ascent. His vision demanded sanctuary, not spectacle. It required silence, not applause. It needed a harbor, not a stage. And you, yes, you, without fanfare or recognition, became that harbor. You were not here to be seen. You were here to be the ground he stands on when the world beneath him trembles. When you shift your identity from wife to covenant keeper, you stop measuring your worth by his praise or his presence or his performance, and you begin measuring it by his progress, by the clarity in his eyes when he speaks of his purpose, by the steadiness in his hands when he reaches for his tools, by the fire that returns to his voice when he remembers why he started. That shift, that quiet internal revolution, is the first awakening, and it changes everything, because once you see yourself not as a bystander in his story, but as the unseen architect of its foundation, you stop shrinking to make room for him and start expanding to hold the weight of what he is becoming. You were not chosen because you were flawless. You were chosen because you are faithful, not because you are loud, but because you are lasting, not because you know the way, but because you will not let him walk it alone, even when he insists he must. That is the sacred assignment. That is the covenant. And if you embrace it without resentment, without expectation, without waiting for him to notice, you will become the quiet force that turns his potential into legacy, his dream into dominion, his flicker into flame. There is a reason your spirit resonates with his purpose, even when his actions confuse you, even when his silence feels like abandonment, even when the weight of holding everything together leaves your bones aching and your heart whispering, "Is this all I am to him?" You were not selected for this role because you are perfect, or patient, or endlessly selfless. You were chosen because you possess a resilience that does not break under pressure, a faith that does not flicker in darkness, a quiet knowing that what he is building is not for him alone, but for something larger than both of you. I once sat with a man in the twilight of his life, his fortune vast, his name etched into the foundations of industry, and he confessed to me with tears in his eyes that none of it would have happened, not the patents, not the factories, not the legacy, if his wife had not held the line during the years when failure was more familiar than success. He told me how she would rise before dawn, not to prod him or plan with him, but to kneel beside their bed and whisper words he could not hear but somehow felt in his marrow. Let his hands be steady, let his mind be clear, let no fear enter this house. She did not speak those prayers to manipulate heaven. She spoke them to align herself with the current of his destiny, and in doing so, she became its guardian. But then came the day she stopped. Not dramatically, not with shouting or slamming doors. She simply grew tired, tired of giving without receiving, tired of believing when he no longer did, tired of carrying the spiritual weight while he carried only the material burden. And when she withdrew, not her body, not her duty, but her belief, something in him fractured. His decisions turned hesitant, his courage thinned like worn fabric. Opportunity slipped through his fingers not because he lacked skill, but because he lacked the atmosphere of certainty she once maintained around him. You are not his cheerleader, you are his atmosphere. And if you poison that air with resentment, if you withdraw it in protest, if you let your exhaustion convince you that your presence no longer matters, you do not punish him, you dismantle the very environment his greatness requires to breathe. God did not place you beside him to be admired. He placed you there to be the vessel through which divine persistence flows into his life. And if you walk away from that, not physically, but spiritually, you do not merely leave a gap in his heart, you leave a vacuum in his destiny. The world will never write your name on his monuments, but I will tell you this, without you, there would be no monuments to build. Your surrender is not submission, it is stewardship. Your silence is not weakness, it is sanctuary. And your faithfulness, even when it feels unseen, even when it feels thankless, is the invisible architecture upon which his visible success is built. So ask yourself not whether he deserves your belief today, but whether the destiny you both signed up for still deserves your guardianship. Because if you loosen your grip not out of malice but out of fatigue, you may not hear the crash when it comes, but you will feel the absence of everything that could have been. I remember the rain that night, not because it was heavy or dramatic, but because it matched the weight in the room, a slow, steady drumming against the windows as if the sky itself was mourning what this man had nearly surrendered. His name was Thomas, though that wasn't the name his mother gave him. It was the name he wore like armor in the world, the one he used when signing contracts and standing before investors and pretending he still believed in the thing that had once set his soul on fire. When he came to me, his shoulders were slumped, not from physical exhaustion, but from the erosion of hope. He spoke of quitting, not as a last resort, but as a mercy, as if walking away from his life's work was the kindest thing he could do for himself, for his family, for the world that had stopped noticing. He didn't need advice. He didn't need strategy. He needed to be seen, not as the man who failed, but as the man who had once dared to try. So I sent for her. His wife arrived quietly, as she always did. No flourish, no fanfare, just the soft click of the door and the rustle of her coat as she stepped inside. She took one look at him, really looked, and without a word, she crossed the room, knelt beside his chair, placed her hand over his trembling fingers, and said only this: "I remember the man who told me he would change how the world moves. He is still here. I can feel him." That was all. No lecture, no pep talk, no list of his past victories or reminders of how far he'd come. Just recognition, just remembrance, just the quiet, unshakable assertion that the man she fell in love with, the dreamer, the builder, the believer, had not vanished. He was buried, yes, but not gone. And something in him broke open then, not in defeat, but in release. He wept, not the tears of a man who is lost, but of a man who has been found. He returned to his workshop that very night, not with a new plan or a fresh strategy, but with something far more powerful, the restored image of himself reflected back to him through the eyes of the one person whose belief he could not afford to lose. 3 months later, he filed his first patent. 5 years after that, his invention was in homes across the country. And when people asked him what changed, he never spoke of market shifts or lucky breaks or sudden inspiration. He always said simply, "My wife remembered me when I forgot myself." That is the power you hold, not in your words, but in your witness, not in your correction, but in your constancy. You do not need to fix him. You need only to remind him of who he is, beneath the failure, beneath the fatigue, beneath the fear. When you speak truth over him, not to flatter, not to soothe, but to remind, you do not encourage him, you resurrect him. And resurrection does not require a crowd. It only requires one voice, whispering in the dark, "I still see you. I still believe. Come back." That whisper is your covenant. That remembrance is your crown. And that quiet act of mirroring his soul back to him, that is the moment his destiny takes its next breath. You do not need to preach from a pulpit or quote scripture at the breakfast table or stage elaborate interventions to influence the trajectory of his life. Your most potent language is not spoken. It is embodied. It lives in the rhythm of your presence, in the steadiness of your gaze, in the unshakable calm you carry into the room even when chaos swirls around you like a storm. I learned this not from books or sermons, but from watching Clara, the wife of a titan whose name still echoes through the halls of industry, a woman who never attended a single board meeting, never reviewed a contract, never offered a single piece of business counsel, yet whose influence was so profound that her husband once told me, quietly, over cigars and brandy, "Without her silence, I would have drowned in my own noise." Every morning without fail, she would bring him his coffee, not with fanfare, not with commentary, just the soft clink of porcelain on wood, the faint warmth of the cup radiating into his palms, the brief grounding pressure of her hand on his shoulder before she turned and left the room. That was all. No agenda, no interrogation, no reminder of what needed to be done, just presence, just ritual, just the quiet affirmation that he was not alone. He told me years later that on the morning she was ill and could not bring it, he felt unmoored, as if the axis of his day had tilted, as if the gravity holding his thoughts in orbit had vanished. It wasn't the coffee he missed, it was the consecration. The ritual was not about caffeine, it was about connection, not about service, but about sanctity. Your consistency is your liturgy. Your quiet faithfulness is your sermon. And when you show up, even when you are bone tired, even when your heart is bruised, even when you wonder if he notices or cares, you are not performing duty, you are practicing devotion. Devotion does not demand recognition, it demands repetition. It does not seek applause, it seeks alignment. And when you align your energy with his purpose, not by pushing, not by prodding, but by simply being the steady, unwavering ground beneath his feet, you create an atmosphere in which his mind can expand, his courage can deepen, and his vision can take root without fear of collapse. I have watched men crumble under the weight of well-meaning advice, shrink beneath the pressure of constant questioning, falter in the face of emotional demands disguised as support, but I have also watched men rise inexplicably, miraculously, when anchored by a woman who understood that her greatest power lay not in changing him, but in believing in him so completely that he had no choice but to believe in himself. You are not here to fix his path. You are here to hold the space around it, to guard it, to sanctify it, to whisper without words, I am here, you are safe, you are seen, you are still the man I believed in. That is how you speak life over him, not with speeches, not with sermons, but with the silent, sacred language of presence, and that language spoken daily becomes the soil from which his destiny grows. There will come a time, perhaps it has already come, when the weight of holding his dreams begins to press against your ribs like a slow, tightening vise, when the silence between you stretches longer than you remember, not because he doesn't love you, but because his mind is wrestling with visions too large for words, when you find yourself lying awake at night, rehearsing conversations that never happened, drafting apologies he never asked for, swallowing fears he never knew you carried. This is not failure, this is friction. The natural resistance that arises when one soul is being stretched to hold space for another's expansion, and if you try to carry those fears without release, if you let them accumulate like dust in the corners of your spirit, they will eventually cloud the very atmosphere you are meant to keep clear for him. That is why I urge you, no, I command you, to set aside one evening each month, not for romance, not for reconciliation, not even for conversation, but for consecration. Choose the first night of the new moon, if you wish, when the sky is dark and the world feels hushed, as if creation itself is holding its breath, and create a ritual that belongs only to you and the unseen force that chose you for this assignment. Light a single candle, not for ambiance, but for focus. Its flame is not decoration, it is declaration. Sit in silence until your breath slows and your thoughts settle. Then take a piece of paper, plain, unadorned, humble, and write his name at the top, not with flourish, not with longing or lament, but with reverence. Beneath it, write this: I surrender my fear for your path. I release my need to control your pace. I trust the force that chose you and chose me to stand beside you. Do not rush. Let each word land in your chest like a stone sinking into deep water. Then when you are ready, place that paper beneath the candle's flame, not to burn it away in anger or desperation, but to sanctify it, to signal to the unseen realm that you are no longer gripping his destiny with white knuckles, but offering it back to the source that entrusted it to you. I have seen women perform this ritual who later reported shifts so subtle they almost missed them, the sudden clarity in his voice during a meeting, the unexpected breakthrough in a project he'd stalled on for months, the quiet return of his laughter at dinner, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. This is not superstition. This is surrender as strategy. You are not giving up your power. You are redirecting it from force to flow, from pressure to permission, from clutching to consecrating. When you release your fear, you make room for faith. Not his faith, but the faith that moves through you and into him like a current he cannot see but can suddenly feel in his bones. And that faith, it does not shout, it does not demand, it simply arrives quiet, certain, unshakable, and begins to rebuild what your fear had begun to erode. Do this monthly, not because it's poetic, not because it's pretty, but because it is necessary, because you cannot pour from an empty vessel, because you cannot hold space for his destiny if your own spirit is crowded with dread, because the moment you surrender your fear, you become not his savior, but his sanctuary, and that is where his greatest work is born. There will come seasons, perhaps you are in one now, when he will pull away, not with anger, not with indifference, but with a quiet intensity that feels like abandonment even though it is anything but. When his mind retreats into caverns you cannot follow, when his hours stretch long into the night without explanation, when he speaks less, touches less, shares less, and you begin to wonder if you've lost him, not to another woman, not to failure, but to the very dream you once whispered about together in the dark. This is not rejection, this is gestation. Just as a seed must disappear into the soil before it can break open and reach for the sun, so too must a man descend into the solitude of creation before he can emerge with something the world has never seen. And your greatest act of love in those seasons is not to chase him, not to interrogate his silence, not to fill the space between you with your anxiety or your need for reassurance, but to hold the perimeter, to become the quiet guardian of the sacred space around him, the one who keeps the world from banging on the door while he wrestles with visions too fragile for daylight. I watched Henry Ford disappear for weeks at a time during the early days of the Model T, not because he had grown cold toward his wife Clara, but because the work demanded a kind of inward focus that could not coexist with conversation, with compromise, with the gentle rhythms of domestic life. And Clara? She did not plead. She did not guilt him. She did not stage interventions or demand he be present. She kept the children's voices low in the hallways. She turned down invitations that would have pulled him into social obligations. She made sure his meals were warm, his clothes were ready, his path home was uncluttered, and then she stepped back. Not out of resignation, but out of reverence. Not because she was passive, but because she understood some battles must be fought alone. Some breakthroughs require isolation. Some masterpieces are born in silence. And when he emerged, thinner, wearier, but alight with something new, it was not gratitude he offered her first, but blueprints. Not apologies, but possibility. Your restraint in those seasons is not weakness, it is wisdom in its most disciplined form. Your patience is not passivity, it is power refined by understanding. You are not shrinking yourself to make room for him. You are expanding your capacity to steward his process, to honor the mystery of his becoming, to trust that what is being forged in his solitude will one day return to bless you both. Do not mistake his withdrawal for rejection. Do not interpret his silence as dismissal. He is not leaving you, he is diving deep, and the deeper he goes, the more he needs you to hold the surface steady. So stand your ground, keep the home warm, guard the peace, and when he resurfaces, blinking in the light, raw from the work, uncertain of his footing, do not rush to fix him or question him or pull him into your world. Simply smile, simply touch his hand, simply say without fanfare, "Welcome back, I never left." That is your covenant, that is your crown. And that quiet, unwavering presence, that is the force that turns his isolation into innovation and his return into triumph. You cannot carry his burden and expect him to grow strong. You cannot hover over his path and expect him to walk with confidence. You cannot clutch his purpose with your fear and expect it to expand into its fullness. Because true power, the kind that moves mountains and alters destinies, does not reside in control, but in release. I have buried men who were brilliant beyond measure, men whose minds could solve equations no one else dared to write, whose hands could build machines that reshaped the world, yet they died hollow. Their greatness stunted not by lack of vision, but by the suffocating weight of a love that refused to let go. Their wives, good women, devoted women, women who loved fiercely and fought tirelessly, mistook their vigilance for virtue, their micromanagement for partnership, their constant correction for care. They stood beside their husbands like generals on a battlefield, shouting orders, adjusting armor, demanding reports, and in doing so, they clipped the wings of the very men they were trying to lift. Do not be that woman. Not because you lack strength, but because your strength is meant for something far more sacred than steering his ship. You are not here to captain his destiny. You are here to sanctify its waters, to be the lighthouse, not the rudder, to be the calm sea beneath him, not the hand that turns the wheel. When you surrender, not from defeat, not from indifference, but from deep, unwavering trust, you become the wind beneath his wings instead of the anchor around his neck. I watched Andrew Carnegie's wife, Louise, sit silently through dinners where her husband raged about setbacks, ranted about rivals, paced the floor with restless energy, and never once did she interrupt. Never once did she offer a solution. Never once did she try to fix his frustration. She simply remained present, unshaken, a steady flame in the storm, and when he finally collapsed into his chair, spent and silent, she would rise, pour him a glass of water, place it beside him, and say only, "You'll find the way. You always do." That was all. No advice, no agenda, just belief, embodied. And time after time, he did find the way, not because she gave him the map, but because she refused to let him believe he was lost. Your surrender is not abandonment, it is alignment. It is the conscious choice to stop wrestling with his process and start stewarding his atmosphere. It is the understanding that your power does not lie in how much you do for him, but in how much space you give him to become. When you release your need to control his pace, you give him permission to find his own rhythm. When you release your fear of his failure, you give him room to risk greatly. When you release your expectation of constant gratitude, you free him to focus on the work, not the performance of appreciation. That is the final truth. Your letting go is his lifting up. Your stillness is his momentum. Your faith, silent and unwavering, is the soil in which his boldest dreams take root. So do not measure your worth by how much he leans on you, but by how freely he soars because you refuse to weigh him down. You were not chosen to be his manager. You were chosen to be his sanctuary. And when you embrace that role, not with resentment, not with reluctance, but with reverence, you do not fade into the background. You become the unseen architecture of his legacy. The world will not write songs about you. They will not carve your name into marble. But the man you love, he will look back one day, years from now, when the crowds have gone quiet and the applause has faded, and he will whisper, with awe, with gratitude, with tears, "I could not have done it without her." And that, my dear, is the only monument you will ever need. Final words. You are not secondary to his story. You are the soil from which it grows, the quiet hum beneath the symphony, the unseen current that carries his vessel when the wind dies and the stars disappear. You were never meant to be applauded on his stage. You were meant to be the reason the stage exists at all. I have walked beside kings of industry and paupers turned pioneers, men whose names shook nations and men whose names were forgotten by noon. And in every case, without exception, behind the man who rose was a woman who chose to hold rather than to hoist, to believe rather than to badger, to surrender rather than to seize. Your power does not roar, it resonates. It does not demand, it endures. And in the stillness of your faithfulness, in the rhythm of your constancy, in the sacred space you carve out with your surrender, you become the silent architect of empires that will outlive you both. Do not wait for him to see it. Do not wait for the world to name it. Begin tonight, light the candle, whisper the prayer, step back when he needs to descend, step in when he needs to remember. Hold the line, not with clenched fists, but with open hands. And when the years have passed and the noise has faded, you will not need a plaque or a pedestal to know your worth. You will see it in the way he looks at you, not with the dazzle of new love, but with the depth of sacred recognition. You will hear it in the quiet between his words, in the steadiness of his stride, in the unshakable certainty that he became who he was always meant to be, because you never stopped believing in him, even when he forgot to believe in himself. That is your covenant. That is your crown. And that, my dear, is the legacy no one can take from you, because it was never written in ink. It was written in fire, in faith, in the unbreakable, unspoken, unforgettable truth that behind every man who changed the world was a woman who refused to let his light go out. Now go and be that woman, not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, now. The world is waiting, and so is he. Key takeaways and action steps. You have walked with me through the sacred terrain of covenant, not as a passive witness, but as the chosen steward of a destiny that was entrusted to you long before you ever spoke vows or signed papers. This is not sentiment, this is strategy. Not poetry, but power refined, rooted, and ready to be activated. Now take what you have received and turn it into motion. Not someday, not when it feels easier. Today. Here is how. 1. Shift your identity from wife to covenant keeper. Begin to see yourself not as a supporting character in his story, but as the spiritual and emotional architect of the environment in which his purpose thrives. You are not here to manage his moods or fix his failures. You are here to hold the frequency of his highest self, even when he cannot feel it himself. Each morning, before you speak a word to him, whisper to your own soul, I am the ground he stands on. I am the air he breathes. I am the keeper of his becoming. Let that truth recalibrate your posture, your presence, your peace. 2. Perform the altar moment ritual monthly, without fail. On the first evening of every new moon or whichever night feels sacred to you, create a space of stillness. Light one candle. Write his name on a plain sheet of paper. Beneath it, write, I surrender my fear for your path. I release my need to control your pace. I trust the force that chose you and chose me to stand beside you. Place the paper gently beneath the candle's flame, not to burn it away in anger, but to sanctify your surrender. Then sit in silence for 5 full minutes, breathing deeply, releasing every thread of anxiety you've been carrying about his journey. Do this not as a gesture, but as a governance, a monthly recalibration of your spirit, so his can remain unburdened. 3. When he withdraws, guard the perimeter. Don't chase the connection. There will be seasons when he retreats, not from you, but into the deep work his soul must do. Resist the urge to pull him back with questions, demands, or emotional bids for attention. Instead, become the silent sentinel of his space. Lower the noise in the home. Shield him from unnecessary obligations. Keep his path clear, and when he resurfaces, do not ambush him with your loneliness. Welcome him with warmth, with quiet presence, with the unspoken assurance, I held the space. You are never alone. Your restraint in these moments is not neglect, it is the highest form of love. 4. Replace anxious words with anchoring presence. You do not need to say, I believe in you every day for him to feel it. In fact, overspeaking your belief can dilute its power. Instead, let your belief be communicated through your consistency, the way you look at him without urgency in your eyes, the way you touch his shoulder without demanding his attention, the way you move through the home without chaos clinging to your footsteps. Your calm is his compass. Your steadiness is his sanctuary. Practice this daily. For 1 full minute, simply sit near him in silence, no phone, no agenda, no expectation, and let your energy say what your lips do not need to. 5. Speak life through recognition, not correction. When you feel the urge to correct him, redirect him, or remind him of what he's neglecting, pause. Instead, ask yourself, what part of his highest self can I reflect back to him right now? Then speak that, not as flattery, but as remembrance. Say things like, I remember how your eyes lit up when you first described this dream, or I still see the man who wasn't afraid to start from nothing, or even, simply, you're closer than you think. These are not empty encouragements, they are soul mirrors. And when a man sees his truest self reflected in the eyes of the woman who knows him best, he cannot help but rise to meet that image. Your first 24-hour missions start tonight. Before midnight, perform your first altar moment. Light the candle, write his name, release your fear, blow out the flame. Then, before he sleeps, walk into the room where he is, stand beside him, place your hand gently over his heart or his shoulder, if that feels more natural, and say, quietly, with full eye contact, I hold your purpose safe. Nothing more, no explanation, no follow-up, just those 5 words. Then walk away. Let the silence do the rest. This is not a suggestion. This is a summons. You were chosen for this, not because it's easy, but because you are equal to it. Now go and steward his destiny as only you can. The world may never know your name, but he will, and that is enough. Remember, your success begins the moment you decide to act.